Okay, thank you. So I'm Kaz and this is Maureen, and we're going to talk about synchronous online maths tutorials, but it's actually more about what everybody here at the University of Wollongong thinks about synchronous online maths tutorials. And the title was originally just online tutes, but we then found in the literature online tutorial often meant self-directed online module to supplement face-to-face classes. So we decided we'd better make it pretty clear that we're talking about an actual class that is run via social media online, and it's synchronous. So now we thought we'd share our practice and tips, because when I came to the session in July, I was actually relieved a couple of times to hear people talk about troubles and difficulties that I'd had. So I think while most of this will be known to almost everybody here, it's nice to hear that other people are struggling with the same things that you are. So what we did was we interviewed all of our staff who had taken tutorials. So about 24 tutors in total, that includes permanent and casual staff, to find out what they thought about this whole online tutorials thing. And we're just going to run through a few of the positives and negatives. So first of all, we talked about attendance. The biggest challenge we had was getting people to show up. So a lot of the time attendance was less than 60%. But we did find that if it was compulsory, like you got a technical fail or your mark was capped, then attendance was great. Or if there was an assessment task on, they'd all show up. But we also found in 300 level and higher subjects, people would show up. We felt that probably because they knew each other and wanted to sort of catch up and chat. And we found declining attendance was common. At the beginning of session, everybody was coming, but then after 3 or 4 weeks, people would sort of fall away. Now, benefit was that if you weren't very well, you could still log into the class and at least listen in. If you live too far away, that applies to the tutor as well as the student. You didn't have to travel very far, it didn't take very long to get there. So there were a couple of nice things about it in regards to attendance, but we also found that students were very distracted while being at home. So something to consider, and we should consider this for any tutorial, have a reason for students to attend more than just answering questions, which could be done in consultation. So why are we having the tutorials is something that we really should be thinking about before we get into the tute. Now, socialization was another issue that came up a lot in our conversations. The biggest challenge was that there was a lot less rapport between the students and staff, but a surprising benefit was that the students enjoyed the privacy. Now, they kind of took it probably too far by having their cameras off most of the time, even though they had them. A lot of students wouldn't talk. They would put something in the chat, and interesting, a lot of them wanted to use the private chat just to the tutor rather than to everybody. But then we had some cohorts that were notably not a problem. So if you were teaching education students, they were all happy to have their cameras on and chit chat away. And we've mentioned already the later years, they know each other, so they were okay. And we also found a couple of times in first year subjects, there would be 18 cameras off and 1 camera on, and that would be the one and only mature age student in that class. So they didn't seem to have as much trouble as everybody else in having their cameras on. And then of course you have the logged in unresponsive person that's still there at the very end, doesn't have any questions, and is probably not actually there at all. They've just logged in, camera off, microphone off, they're not really there. So 19 out of 24 commented they regularly had people doing that. So these are problems that we had. So the challenge for the tutors, when you can't see them, it's really hard, particularly when you're in breakout rooms. If you send them off to breakout rooms, you can only go and visit one little group of students at a time, whereas if you're in a classroom, you can sort of see everyone. It's hard to interact with them, and overall, everybody said it was just not fun. But benefits, students found the private chat great, and groups, actually some groups worked better in the breakout room space because they couldn't be overheard. So it was my experience, a couple of times I'd show up and there'd be chit chat, and as soon as they knew I was there, everything would go silent, but that was kind of funny. And also, everybody can hear you quite well. Now, at Wollongong, we run a lot of our tutorials in whiteboard rooms, particularly in first year. And And they are very much student driven. We walk in with a sheet of problems that we're going to all talk about. You hand out the sheet and they get themselves into groups, or they work on their own and they work. And it's certainly driven by student questions and student work. Sometimes there might be a short tutor demonstration, but not always. And tutor can help wherever the tutor sees that there's a need. So we went from that to this online space where you couldn't see anybody, you couldn't see what they were doing. They weren't talking to one another, they weren't talking to you, and it was just really, really hard. We found that online tutorials were tutor driven. They relied on the tutor to generate the discussion. The tutor ended up presenting all the solutions to questions, and you have the same few students were active. Less than half the classes were active. There was certainly a lack of motivation, and students lost interest very quickly. But those that were willing, they would actually work better together in the breakout rooms. Now, one other interesting thing that came out in our discussions with staff was that labs actually worked better online. So we had a few statisticians that we interviewed. They had computer labs, and they found that they had better interaction with their students online because they could share screens and they could see very, very easily what everybody was doing compared to a tutorial. I see there's a question in the chat. What's the duration of your whiteboard tutes? They're about, they go for an hour, is a standard tute. Some of the stats go for an hour and a half. Okay. Now, in terms of teaching and learning, these are the challenges that came up through our discussion. First of all, as a tutor, you came out of every online tutorial absolutely exhausted because you've got to use lots of energy. You generate all the discussion, you generate all the problems, all the interactions, and you also have to keep track of all of your content, your polls or your software, or the presentation, and dealing with student having trouble with their IT as well. So you're kind of quite exhausted. There was a lot of repetition with breakout rooms. You put the students in there and you would go and visit the breakout rooms, find that you're saying the same thing over and over again. And we also found another thing that came out was everything just takes longer. You end up covering less. I don't know how many times I wished I'd had an hour and a half for my tutes when they were online as opposed to an hour. And of course, we had a massive increase in email. Some of the tutors actually commented about feeling useless because they didn't know if what they were saying was actually correct. Because turning to the learning side of things, we can't see the student work. It was hard to address those personal issues that students have. It was hard to fix small mistakes. Now, compared to a whiteboard room, we would be able to spot those almost immediately, but we just simply couldn't see them. And because we couldn't see the students, we couldn't read body language. You can't gauge their reaction. You don't know whether what you're saying is right. It was really, really hard. And we also found that there was actually no peer-to-peer help. They were much more reluctant to help one another and ask each other questions and talk about things than in a normal tutorial. Now, benefits, however, and when we embarked on doing these interviews, I actually thought there would be no benefits, but I was quite surprised to hear that there were benefits. First of all, when you're teaching and you go, oh, I'd like to show you X, Y, Z, you've got it there. It's on your computer. You just pull it up, away you go. It was also really good that you knew everybody could see your screen. You didn't have heads in the way or people moving around. And even though low attendance, we earlier commented, was possibly a negative thing, it actually meant you only have a small class. So turning to the learning side of things at the bottom there, that low attendance means that you can get individual help because, well, sometimes no one else was there. But in a computer lab, students can share their screen, and from the learning perspective, the students actually could take screenshots of what you had written, and they could take a record of, they could have a better record of the class. So there were some benefits in terms of teaching and learning. Although two people did say, when they said, what were the benefits? They basically very quickly said none. So overall, it wasn't a positive experience. However, we believe it's here to stay. I know certainly at University of Wollongong, we're still going to have some online classes next year because we still have international students who aren't here. And there are rumours that this might continue beyond that issue. So let's see if we can come up with some strategies to make them a little bit better. And this is what we found. I'll hand over to Maureen.
Okay, thanks, Kaz. So these are some of the strategies that we tried to adopt, and so remembering, I guess in a way we're speaking mostly about first year students, but this applies to later year students as well. So in particular for first year students, you know, we're talking about their first class in their first week of their first session of university. So even if we were face to face, we would, a lot of the things that I'm saying here are going to be true anyway. Sorry. So I can't read very well. I have to get a bit close. You know, we would always set our expectations and make some very clear statements about what we expect students to do. I mean, made very clear statements about wanting students to have cameras on, although as Kaz said, we had issues with that, and certain cohorts, and in particular the education students, I think they have to have their cameras on for their education subjects, so they were more willing to do that. The whole investigating the mute, unmute, and perhaps some of this won't be so much of an issue next year because many of our commencing students will have had more online learning in their high school. I'm not sure. You know, practice using things. I think last year we were all very new to Zoom as well. Sorry, I got a bit of a problem with my vision. So we were learning a lot of things to do with Zoom and sharing whiteboards. Everything was new to us as well as to students. So I think at least we are a little bit more adept with it moving forward. So, for example, if I was in a whiteboard room in a face-to-face class, in my first tutorial, I might have like a human bingo or something, just as a way to get students to introduce themselves to each other in their first class. So have some sort of icebreaker and not just jump straight in, and practice using things and annotating. And maybe it means in our first class, we have to concede that they're not going to do 50 minutes of maths. They're going to do, I don't know, less than 50 minutes, because we're going to spend a little bit of time just playing with the platform that we're on, and just everyone getting to know each other a little bit. Practice the breakout rooms, practice the polls, and learn how to share screens, because that's something students were often very reluctant to do. And you'd go into a breakout room and no one would have shared a screen, and you're going, we're kind of into session. I think someone should have figured that out by now. You know, as with a face-to-face class, be very explicit about our instructions and expectations, and have specific tasks. I admit in my cheat sheets, I always have far more than you could cover in the class. So really just say, we're going to discuss these questions today, or have a poll at the start maybe to say, is there anything particular you want us to look at? But if not, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go into a breakout room and we're going to talk about this. And then we're going to come out and then we're going to do this next thing. So people have a good idea of what the expectations are, what the amount of time you want to spend on things is. And not every week has to be the same, by the way. I mean, some questions lend themselves really well to discussion in a breakout room without much working. Other things maybe are better discussed as a group, because you know from experience students don't know how to get started. So you want to guide that discussion. Have this sort of solve, share. So do put students, give them a task, come back and share what's happening, you know, set the next task, have it very directed. Whereas in a whiteboard room, students are pretty much self-paced and you sort of respond as we need to. I always found the breakout rooms, I struggle with managing them because I spend too much time in each room, and so I ended up using them less, but different people probably manage those differently. The whole notion of fixed or random groups, some students are great in the breakout rooms, other students are very quiet or can't write or don't have a camera, makes it very passive. Try to mix up the activities, and I suppose somewhere in there try to have a little bit of fun in there as well, because if we're in a face-to-face class, you know, we always have just a bit of general chit chat, and it's a nice interaction. So somehow try to manage that as well, and encourage the peer-to-peer help, which is not easy, I don't think, online. All
right, so another thing that came up were some tools that people have been using to help with some of this peer-to-peer learning, and to try and claw back some of the benefits of face-to-face. So one thing that a colleague used quite extensively was Zoom polls. He did say you need to plan in advance, but you would have a weekly icebreaker, and if you have a discussion in the middle, you can have a poll to promote that discussion or to find out what everybody's opinion was mid-discussion. He said the disadvantage is you can't use math symbols, but you can use written language. And it was really good for getting students to start talking about things or have a laugh or just break the ice. So yeah, I did that. And my favorite one was, are you still in your pajamas at a 10:30 tutorial class? So, you know, you can ask silly things like that just to get the mood going. Maureen, you used concept board?
So actually, I think I saw information about concept boards at a similar meeting last year. So I wasn't loving the whiteboards in Zoom itself. So I thought we could go with the concept board. And I quite liked it for a few reasons. Typically what I would do is just put the whole sheet on there so you can see it at a glance, some sort of little banner, but you can also put a bit of information about things coming up at the same time. And but then I would clip each question so that there was space underneath the question for working. But then you might go, well, let's remind them about a little bit of theory or a definition or something like that. So in the same way Kaz was saying earlier that you can, one of the sort of benefits of being online is that you've got all your resources at your fingertips to share with students. You could build the concept board to have a lot of information on there as extra information, but it's clipped from the lecture notes or whatever, so it's in exactly the same format as a reminder of, you know, the links between the lecture material and the tutorial questions. So you could generate some peer-to-peer discussion. One of the things I quite liked about it is when I would go into concept board, I could see that other students had kept, I would just share it every week, the link. I could see that students had, from the previous tutorial to the next week's tutorial, actually gone back in and had a look at the concept board because they had kept the link. So they were revisiting it to look at the working and the notations and so on. So actually there was, I guess in this, as Kaz said, you could always take a screenshot, but they were sort of going back in and moving around. One of the funny things about concept board though, I found that if everyone's huddling around the same place, you can't actually see where people are trying to write because there's all these little arrows with their names attached, which was actually, it's like a little swarm of bees moving around. Anyway, that's just a side note. So there are aspects about concept board that I found quite useful. I'm sure there's other platforms that are, or, you know, third-party products that are similar to that, but this was pretty simple to use, and if you had more than one sheet, you build the first one and duplicate it, and then, you know, you can roll them out for the rest of the week or whatever.
The other platform that came up now, I have to thank Louise Manitsky, sorry, from UQ, who introduced Desmos to this group in July, because it really helped a lot of people, few people here who trialed it, to claw back some of the things that we'd lost from moving from face-to-face to online. So in face-to-face, our tutorials are very student-driven and you can see what the students are doing, whereas we'd lost that completely. Desmos and GeoGebra has a very similar feature where you can set up your questions online, and the students just go and start working, and you can see there the dots, the list on the left are the students in the class, and the dots are with which question they were up to. And you can click on a question and see what they've actually answered. And the nice thing about this is that I can now correct mistakes when I find the mistakes. I don't have to wait for a student to ask when they get into trouble. I can actually pinpoint and I can give feedback. Now, it can be a bit tricky when you add this to breakout rooms or polls or whatever else you're running in your class, but I did get some of those benefits come back. And as a learner, when you combine it with the breakout rooms, you've got peer-to-peer communication. Now, one thing I found early on when we moved online is students had trouble writing maths on the screen so other people could see it, because they only had access really to a whiteboard where they had to use their mouse to try and write. And when we introduced this, it very easily does, say, powers or square roots, and the students could do it, and the students could do it easily. And so they started then to talk to one another and write things for each other much more quickly, much more readily. and they started to share ideas and share resources. We did find that having a class of 25 all doing their thing on Desmos was really hard to keep a track of. So we put them in breakout rooms and said, pick a spokesperson, and that one person sort of entered everything into Desmos, and then we would go and visit that breakout room when we detected that there was a problem. So there are workarounds for everything. Now, I did find Desmos was easy to set up. I didn't do anything fancy. You can do fancy stuff if you want to, but I didn't go that way. We just did it nice and simple and straightforward. And once again, clawed back that peer-to-peer communication that we lost by moving online. So that's our experience. And after we put all these things together and stood back, we, as a group, we worked out what our best advice is if you're doing stuff online. Synchronous online tutorials, I should say. We don't have a silver bullet for a start, but we should always have a purpose for the class, because we're asking them to come to something that's not fun necessarily. So have a reason for them to come. Set your tone or expectations in the first class and then persist with those. Structure your class, choose critical questions or activities that you want them to do. Give lots of short activities with clear instructions, and provide accountability. So reporting back or an assessment so that they actually feel that they're contributing or that there's a reason for doing what they're doing. So that's a summary of what the staff at the University of Wollongong believe about online tutorials. Overall, we don't like them, but they are better than nothing. And we're certainly over time are learning to do them much better than we did when we first started. So thank you very much. Any questions?